I know how to wow an audience. I spent a lot of years practicing. When it all comes down to it, the best advice I could give is the best advice that I ever got. And it was from my favorite minister, Arthur Burt, who was a very special Welsh evangelist who spoke in parables. And what he told me back in the 80s was, Cindy, he said, Cindy, don't prepare your message, just prepare your heart. And that's what I try to do. Sometimes that's more difficult than others. Like today, my heart's been prepared, but never enough to feel like I want to share something that will transform your life if you believe what I have to share. And what I have to share are things that can't be unseen once you see them. And so it's even more difficult to feel like I know what someone's mental, emotional, and spiritual health is like in order for them to be able to digest the material that I offer. When I started my research, I was really vulnerable, but more than that, I was fearful because of what had taken place in January of that year in DC. I just could not wrap my mind around how I could stand there and watch guards open the doors and let people in that big domed white place, and then go home and see on the news that something completely different had taken place. I couldn't believe my eyes, but I was right there. It changed me. And all I could think of was, I've got to get to the bottom of this. And that's where I've been since that very day. My research had started before, in light of what was going on out there in the big U, and I had uncovered a lot of information relative to that on the internet. However, it caused me to get shut down a couple times on the internet, which scared me. So at that point, I realized that I was going to have to be more savvy about where I found information. And I started collecting and looking at old books. I've always loved antiques. So I happened to have a number of little books that here's some of them. A number of little books that I had collected, but never really read in entirety because they're so difficult to read. It requires a lot of, you gotta stay with it. And it's also usually in Old English, and the S's are usually, like they used to do them, and the F's and the S's and all that. And so it's not easy. So I started reading them. At that same time, I have been a rock collector from way back. Although I have absolutely zero education about rocks, other than I've always loved them, along with all nature, but particularly rocks. And so I was looking to learn more about fossils. I collected a bunch of bones, which I'll show you off the shore. And I was trying to learn that. So lo and behold, who do I find? Randall Carlson. Now, Randall is teaching a class on sacred geometry. And when I saw it, it absolutely blew my mind. It blew my mind, I'm telling you. You can ask anybody that came in my house during that period of years that I found Randall, and I would make them sit on the couch and watch the great year design and how the numbers are miraculously intertwined and how everything is interrelated in number and in geometry. And I was like, how can this be? How? And the more I learned, the more curious I was. So there was a part. In this, Randall actually took me through the great year procession of the equinoxes. And I began to understand, because I'd never really been passionate about space, although I've always been intrigued with science, just intrigued. So when I began to learn what Randall was teaching, it connected perfectly with all my early 60s and 70s understanding about astrology, right? So that was a good connection. And the more I learned, the more everything in the world began to connect in ways that I had never thought possible. If you've studied the Bible or been involved in any religious organization, you know that they have one goal, and that's to keep you on the road that they want you on. And the Bible only has one road, and you stay on it and you look at those scriptures over and over and over. Sometimes I would spend a week on one scripture to understand it. And honestly, it was so contradictory. I just made excuses for God all the time. Yeah, I became an expert. You know why? I worked in death care and I buried people. That's a long story, but I gave it my all. I could preach a sermon like nobody's business. Once I preached a sermon and everybody in the whole building fell down. Yeah. So, and then I've seen so many miracles that just are not explainable until we begin to look deeply. So that part came together. So I had that sacred geometry. Okay, so when you learn that, you learn about the great year and the Kali Yuga and all that background, because now you're looking at an ancient civilization's terminology and that kind of thing. Now, what does that do? That leads you to go, we've got some calendar challenges here. This calendar doesn't go with that one. What's this about? And then you begin to realize that there's no way, without a whole lot of work or AI, that you can ever sync all the different calendars to understand our history. Because One civilization uses 60, and one uses 10. And in one, a day is a year. Do you see what I mean? And then there's a different name for a day or a year, depending on the language. And in Egypt, the calendar started with the Pharaoh. Crazy stuff. So there's never been a chronology that can really be trusted. And the one in the Bible is the least likely. It's got so many errors. So you start looking at that and go, things aren't just as they seem. All right, so the calendars, there's a problem there. And you start to try and reconcile. Because like this one little old book that I found, The Light of Egypt, has a story in there. And it talks about the different earth ages and how long they are, 12,900 years, and everything's perfect. And they lay it right out for you. But these little books have disappeared. We're not taught about them. I never heard about them. And when you go to look for them, they're hard to find and very expensive. And most of the stuff that we need to connect the dots is filed in occult. Very interesting, isn't it? And we don't even want to get into the books that are hidden in the Vatican, right? So there's another part. Then, the next thing that really happened was I was in Vacation Bible School. Now, think about the timing here. In January, I was in D.C. Vacation Bible School, I believe, was in June or July of that same year. As I was there helping with the kindergartners, a young girl came in full of whatever it is you're supposed to be full of that I used to be full of, and started talking about how do we know about Jesus. Weird, right? And I'm just sitting there and she goes, Josephus. And it dawned on me, my goodness, girl, how have you studied the Bible for 33 years and never studied Josephus, who is the main historian? What's wrong with you, girl? It's not like me. But then I was a sheep and I was being led as to what to read. So I started studying. And good old Josephus. Man, did light bulbs ever go off in my head. Josephus, according to this story, was leading a band of like 100 Jews, and the Romans were close behind. Josephus talked to his guys and went, look, we don't want the Romans to tear us apart. Let's just take our future into our own hands and commit suicide. At least the Romans won't have do with us. So, went around the circle, boom, boom, boom. Guess who drew the last straw? You didn't guess Josephus, did you? Yes! And he conveniently decided to hang in there and went and hid in a cave. He was afraid. His own people sure didn't like him, and neither did the Romans. But soon someone came along and said, hey, Josephus, man, you're a big old hero down in Rome. Get your butt up. Make yourself known. So he turned himself in and became the main historian for the Jesus story. Isn't that just groovy? Later on, I would find that he never existed. We'll get to that. Talking about a fiasco, I was so angry because I kept thinking that I had spent 33 years of my life studying people that might not have ever existed. Yeah. Yep. Okay. What's the next thing that happened here? So much synchronization, it's gonna blow your mind. Okay, the next thing that happened was I had been working with my mom on Ancestry. She loved history, particularly American history, and so did I. Little did she know at that time when she died in 2017, we are related directly to some pretty savvy characters back in the beginning of the country, including John Smith, and my son is directly related to Pocahontas. So I had access to lots of records that maybe the normal person wouldn't, and I was digging in. I happened to find out that Pocahontas was just used as a marketing tool over in London to prove that they could indeed make real people out of the banshees over here. Yeah, there's plenty of proof, and I've got it. So that was a joy to find. And I'm still uncovering stuff about that. It's deep. All that's deep. And the next step, I'm trying to think. Okay, so at that same time, I had determined, like a year before all this, that I wanted to speak Hebrew and understand it so that I could better understand the Bible. So you start looking into language, and then you go back to Paleo-Hebrew, right? And you start digging in, and then you find there's cuneiform. And when you find cuneiform, that opens up the life of Sumeria. At that same time, I was going through a deep depression. My entire family has always dealt with mental disorders like depression. My dad was bipolar, severe ADHD, those kinds of things. And not unlike a lot of families, we had a lot of trauma growing up. So I was determined somehow to get some information on how to fix these snowball type problems that our family kept just, precipitating in our lives without knowing it. So I had studied all my life. I've always been a studier. I'd studied Dr. Amen and his clinics on brain health, thinking that there is such a long line in our history of depression, etc., I want to figure it out. So when I looked at Dr. Amen's protocol for a brain scan, thinking that if I could get a scan, it would clue me into my parents and my son and etc., and be helpful information, it was like $30,000, and I had to fly to LA or California somewhere. So when I was depressed at this time, I was desperate to figure it out. And I threw out all my antidepressants. I had been on them for 30 years, 200 milligrams of Zoloft. So I knew on one hand why I was severely depressed, because I'd gone cold turkey. But at the same time, I wasn't going to take any more pharmaceuticals, and I had to figure this out. Are you with me? So I call around, I find Amen Clinic, and guess what? $5,000, and they had an office in Atlanta. My husband was not very helpful. He did not, and still doesn't, understand depression any more than you or I do. It's baffling. I drove myself up there and turned myself in for a brain scan. The results were a lot more than I ever hoped for. That's a whole nother ball of string. But the point at this time in the story is that it led me to ketamine treatments recommended by an Atlanta psychiatrist to help me. And during a treatment, I saw before me Sumeria and the Sumerian complex, and I never knew it existed before. And it gave me peace. Weird. What next? So I began reading a lot of things, and one day I found some things about language that intrigued me. I was on a search to find what was the first language, how did it come, what did it mean? I just needed some foundational help. And I found on the internet, which I was still using at that time, a guy that had written about the Hebrew development of their language and how it had come about, which was all tied in to the Torah and the codes in it, which intrigued me. So at that point, I quickly texted, "I need to talk to you." And I never expected an answer. He was a famous guy, this Doug Vogt person. He answered me, and I just said, "I need to meet you." He ended up being in Orange Park. I took him to lunch after reading his material. It didn't sink in. I wasn't a brain scientist or a physicist, but it did sink in conceptually, and I knew that there was truth there, and that if there was truth, I could get it. And it's taken me 3.5 years to begin to get it. And I've had to study everything on the side, physics and science and biology and all that stuff. But I've been into it because of the synchronization I have been led. And one thing's opened the next door. When I got Doug's book, one of the first concepts that was difficult for most people was computer data. In looking at a multi-dimensional world. Well, when I was in junior high school, I took data processing, and I wired those big old dinosaur boards and put them in those big old machines. And I watched that information or that plug make that big old machine type something out or punch something up. And I had that up here. I got it. So I had that part. I think this is a good place to start, and then we'll get into the book. But hopefully that gives you a little glimpse into where I've been and why I'm here. Truth is freedom.